Hello and welcome back to the Best of Broadway, the hit #1 musical theater podcast on the market right now. I'm your host, Courtney, and today we're going to be talking about a very special, fan favorite, really beloved musical, and that one is Oliver! So before I start talking more about Oliver, I figured I'd give you guys at home a little bit of the production history behind it. So the musical Oliver is based upon the book Oliver Twist, which was Charles Dickens' second book. And this is actually the first time I've recorded that intro correctly because I keep saying Charles Darwin, who's a scientist, but anyways, so it's based off the book Oliver Twist that was published between 1837 and 1839. As for the musical itself, the lyrics and music were written and composed by Lionel Bart. It premiered in West End in 1960, and it had revivals in 1977, 1994, 2008, and 2011. It also had a really big movie made after it in 1968, which ended up winning 6 Academy Awards. So now that all of the production history is out of the way, I figured I'd give you guys who are unfamiliar with this story a basic plot summary, and I'm going to try to keep this short. But the story follows an orphan boy named Oliver in England who works at a workhouse with a bunch of other orphans. And one day he decides to ask the caretakers if he can have more food. And this really upsets Mr. Bumble and Widow Corney, who are the caretakers. And Mr. Bumble tells Oliver to pack up his things, and he sells him to an undertaker. The next day, Oliver gets in a fight with another apprentice of the undertaker, which he ends up getting locked up, and he runs away all the way to London, where he meets another boy his age known as the Artful Dodger. The Artful Dodger and Oliver become sort of friends, and he decides to take him back to Fagin's lair. And Fagin is an old criminal who teaches young boys how to pickpocket. The next day, Oliver, the Artful Dodger, and another boy are sent to pickpocket a wealthy old man known as Mr. Brownlow. But it doesn't go well, at least not for Oliver. The Artful Dodger and the other boy are able to get away, but Oliver is caught and he is taken with Mr. Brownlow. And that's basically the summation of Act 1. In Act 2, we open up to Nancy, and she is the girlfriend of Bill, who is a grown-up boy that Fagin taught, and him and Fagin work together, and Bill's really abusive towards Nancy, but I'll talk more about that later. Anyways, it opens up with Nancy singing some songs with the boys at a tavern when the Artful Dodger runs in, and he says that Oliver had been kidnapped, basically, taken with Mr. Brownlow. And Nancy, Bill, and Fagin decide that they need to go kidnap him back. They're afraid that Oliver is going to spill all the secrets about Fagin and his lair and their whereabouts, and they are concerned for themselves, so they decide to set out and find Oliver. The next day, Oliver and Mr. Brownlow kind of find a bit of a friendship, I guess, and Mr. Brownlow sends Oliver to return some library books. And while Oliver's doing that, Nancy and Bill find him, and they kidnap him and take him back to Fagin's lair. While all this is happening, back at the workhouse, this old lady comes in to Mr. Bumble and the widow, and she has this beautiful gold locket, and she says it's from Oliver's mother, and she wanted to return it before she died. Now, Bumble and Corney realized that Oliver could have some wealthy relatives because this locket was so nice. So they set out to go find who these relatives are so that they can get wealthy. And they do that by going to Mr. Brownlow. Mr. Brownlow had put in the paper that he wanted information on Oliver's whereabouts since he had been kidnapped and he was concerned for him. So the caretaker is able to find Mr. Brownlow, and, he realizes that they're in it just for the money, not because they actually care about Oliver. So he's doesn't seem too keen to help them, but when he looks at the locket, he opens up and he sees a picture of Oliver's mother, who happens to be his daughter, making Mr. Brownlow Oliver's grandfather. Now, Nancy has come to care for Oliver and has taken a liking to him, and she decides that she wants to do what's best for him, and so she defies her boyfriend, Bill, and she meets up with Mr. Brownlow, and she says that she will meet him at the London Bridge with Oliver at midnight to return him. Unfortunately, Bill is kind of suspicious of her activity, and he follows her out to the bridge, and he ends up beating her to death, knocking Oliver unconscious and kidnapping him. Mr. Brownlow eventually gets to the bridge and he notices Nancy's dead body and Oliver's missing. So him and a whole bunch of mob of people are searching to find Bill and Oliver. And they find Bill on the top of a bridge holding Oliver hostage, but he's shot and Oliver is reunited with Mr. Brownlow, and the mob decides to go after Fagin, and Fagin decides that this is probably a good time to straighten out his life and quit his criminal activity. So that is the basic plot line of Oliver. When I first read about it, it really reminded me a lot of Annie, but anyways, I thought it was really interesting. And here's some fun facts before I get into more of the analysis part of the musical. So this show has been performed in 20 different languages, including Icelandic. Phil Collins, our beloved Phil Collins, who helped compose Tarzan, actually played the Artful Dodger in one of these revivals. And an interesting thing about Bart Leonel is he wasn't a typical composer. He didn't really know how to write music, but he just sang recordings of himself, of melodies and tunes that he liked, and that's what helped him write Oliver. So, in terms as the most interesting character, it's maybe not what you think. Not the main character, but Fagin. I thought Fagin was by far the most interesting character. Honestly, to me, Oliver wasn't that interesting of a character. It seems to me that the plot happened to him and he didn't really do much to further it, in my opinion. But I thought Fagin was a really interesting character because he seems to be more morally gray. I like characters who aren't all good or all bad because I think they're boring. There's no depth to them. But Fagin has something there. You know, when you first meet him and see him, he definitely seems to be pretty evil, right? I mean, he's a criminal and, you know, he teaches these young kids how to be criminals so he can just take money from wealthy people. But I think there's more to him than meets the eye. I think even though he doesn't want to show it, I think he genuinely does care about these kids. And of course, he is kind of exploiting them to, you know, using their youth and their agility to get at this money. But you know, Bill used to be one of his apprentices, his students, I guess, and Bill grows up to be not a great guy. He's mean, he's abusive, and eventually turns into a murderer. And, you know, Fagin really does not want the rest of these kids to grow up and be like Bill. And, you know, I think and after the whole ordeal with Oliver, you know, where he's put in life-threatening situations, he really takes a step back and he really analyzes his life and that it's not too late to change. And even in the middle of the musical, I think right before Act 2, even he starts to question, should I still be a criminal? I mean, it's not something that he's super proud of or boastful of or that he loves. I think it's just something he feels he has to do because he was a criminal before he came over. It's all he knows how to do. And I think it puts a really interesting perspective that not all villains or not all criminals in stories and in real life, they're not just all bad. There's a person behind, there's reasoning behind their motives and what they do. And he's certainly a lot more interesting than Bill, who I think is definitely just really not a great guy. But Fagin was definitely my favorite character and the most interesting character. As for the songs, I chose kind of two to talk about. My favorite song, I think, is Where Is Love? It's just really different from a lot of the rest of the songs in the musical. Most of the songs in the musical are really fun and upbeat, and this one's definitely slow, and I think it just sounds so pretty. And it really illustrates how sad the musical is, because Oliver's such a young boy, and he sings about how nobody loves him, and it foreshadows the end of the musical. He's talking about how he'll have to travel so far and wide if he ever wants to find love, which is true. He ends up running away all the way to London, but he ends up meeting his grandfather there and ends up finding people who really genuinely care about him. And this sounds kind of weird, but I feel like strong British accents are just so distracting to me. I don't know why. It's just maybe because I'm not used to it. So when I hear strong British accents, it's all I can kind of think about. But in a lot of the songs that I listen to of Where Is Love, a lot of the covers, the British accent is quite as strong. It's a little more subtle. And I think that just sounds prettier to me. I don't know if that's mean or not to British people. But I also wanted to give a shout out to You've Got to Pick a Pocket or Two. I just thought that song was so funny and it was really upbeat, and I really liked the choreography to it. It was really fun and clever. So I just really liked that one too. As for things that aged well, the or the book was written a long time ago, and the musical is decently old too, 1960, I guess. Well, it's way before my time. But it still talks a lot about subjects that I think are still relevant today, such as domestic abuse, which I'll talk more about that in a second, and human trafficking. Oliver is sold to be a worker for someone. And Charles Dickens, when he wrote his stories, he put in situations that he experienced in some way or another, so that all people from all walks of life can see it and recognize these problems and hopefully change something about it. So clearly these were problems that were affecting him and his society back then that are still going on today. And so I think it's just done a really great job at staying relevant and still bringing up these important topics so that we can think more about it and how we want to combat it. Sorry. It also touches on poverty and what it drives people to do. And in this country and in countries all around the world, there are people who wouldn't necessarily be criminals, but they feel they're put in these such unfortunate circumstances that they feel like there's nothing else that they can do. And I think it really shines a light on those people and makes us see them in a more human way. I think this whole show, especially with Fagin's character and all the workhouse boys, it makes you see that there's people behind these labels. There's people behind the word orphan and behind the word criminal. They're not just, they're labels. They don't perfectly describe a person. So I really like those aspects of the show and how they've still stayed relevant today. As for picking nits about it, in my research, I saw that a lot of people had an issue with Fagin and how it was anti-Semitic in a way. And I guess he has a lot of really stereotypical Jewish characteristics, both physically and with the way he talks and the way he acts. And I don't know if I can really touch much on this subject because I'm not Jewish and I'm not familiar enough with that religion to say so, but I would hope that people who are putting on this performance aren't intentionally trying to insult Jewish people. But something that really stuck out to me that I didn't really like is Nancy's character arc. She's the most prevalent female role throughout the show, and I just didn't really like her character and how it all ended. So she has a really abusive boyfriend, which unfortunately people still have to deal with today at domestic abuse. But she always is making excuses for him, saying he beats her, but it's just he just doesn't know how to show, he loves me, he just doesn't show it, or he needs me, like I can't just leave him, like that kind of stuff. She's making excuses for it. And at the end she does decide to defy him by deciding to return Oliver to who he actually belongs to. And obviously that's not what Bill would have wanted, but her defying him ends up in her murder. And that doesn't sit right with me to just I'd rather have her I think it would have been better if she stayed alive. She's, you can see that she's brainwashed into thinking that this is what love is. But then, and she defies him, and then after she defies him, and then she's able to escape that abusive relationship and be happy. I think that would have sat with me a lot better. Or at the very least, throughout the musical, she recognized that his behavior isn't right, instead of her just being okay with being in this abusive relationship and then ends up getting murdered for doing something wrong. The character arc just didn't sit well with me personally. I didn't like that. It just, I just don't like the character arc for her. And it's sad that she's the most prevalent woman character in it, and then she doesn't have a great ending for her. As for a revival, this was very tricky for me to think about, but as for general changes, I think it would be fun to add some more girls into the ensemble. It could kind of be like a Newsies thing. You don't have to explicitly say that they're a girl or boy, but you could definitely add more girls to work in the workhouse. You can have more girls that Fagin is teaching to be criminals, just to get some more diversity in there. And this is changing a major part of the story, but if I could do whatever I want, I would probably keep Nancy alive at the end of the show. Just have Bill knock her unconscious on the bridge or something. That just sits better with me, that Nancy can kind of get a happy ending and not have to end up dying from her abuser. I just really hate that, and I don't think it would change the story too drastically, and I think it would just sit better with me. As for who I would cast, I feel like Oliver just has to be a really cute kid that you can sympathize with. So the first actor I thought of was Jacob Tremblay, because I think he's just a really cute kid, and if I saw him getting abused on stage, I would probably cry because he just looks like such a cute, sweet kid. For Bill, I thought of the actor Skeet Ulrich. I don't know why, but I can just see him, like, he just looks like he can be so tough and mean, and you're supposed to hate Bill. He's like the worst, and I could just see him up there on stage just being hated. I don't know. And Bill doesn't have any songs, so he doesn't need to be a good singer. As for Nancy, I thought she was a good alto part because I'm an alto myself, and I found it pretty easy to sing her songs. And so I thought of Amy Spanger. I don't know how to pronounce her last name, but she's a good alto, and I like the look of her because I think she seems mature enough that you can believe that she's tough enough to be living in this lifestyle, but she also looks and acts sweet enough that you can feel pity for her and her situation. And Fagin was such a hard one to come up with because he's just, you know, he's got to be kind of like old and mean and creepy looking, because you don't really, you know, he's a criminal. So this is really hard for me to think of, and I don't know if this is cheating, but in one of the old revivals, he was played by Rowan Atkinson, and I really liked him based on his look and his portrayals of the character. Yeah, that's what I would have in my revival, and hopefully it'd be good. As for endorsement, I think, you know, this is important because it's one of, and if not like the most famous British show, and it's what all the British schools do. It's like they're Wicked or something. I don't know. It's been around for a while, and it's really popular. And I think people should see it because it has a lot of really fun and catchy songs. Like that one song, like Everything I Do, is so catchy. It's been stuck in my head all day, and they're really fun to sing, but there's also substance to the show, and there's definitely things that you can learn, and, you know, there's sad parts, and tackles topics that are still relevant today. And I think it's still relevant to musical theater because it's something that can be enjoyed by a lot of people. It's something that I think my little brothers would really enjoy, and also my dad really enjoys it too, and, you know, my best friend that's a girl really enjoys it. So I think it's for people of all ages and kind of everyone it appeals to in a way. And I think it's, you know, it's not just for like one specific group of people. I think it's for people who like musical theater in general. Anyways, thank you for tuning in to my podcast. I hope you learned something new, and yeah.